Let me give you a little background here. I worked on self-other relations during the 1990s and tried to establish how a certain political self, be that Russia, Norway, whatever, tries to constitute itself in relation to its outside. So every time we say something about a certain other collective, we are creating a bond between the self and the other, and the other, since the self is what is limbed off, what is cordoned off from the other is constitutive of the self. That's the basic idea. Now, in the 90s, I did 2 books on this using textual evidence, but there is no reason whatsoever why we shouldn't look at how the self is constituted in terms of other stuff, not texts, but, for example, monuments. And by monuments, I simply mean markers in landscapes or seascapes that are of such magnitude that outsiders will see them. And the specific question I've asked for this project is, how do monuments in world history depict the other? If monuments celebrate the self, and they do, they're actually intended to celebrate the self. That's the whole point of monuments. And the self is imbricated with its others, then it stands to reason that we might ask, where is the other in monuments? Because the other is always there in some kind of form. And this presentation will suggest that in world history there are 3 different ways of doing this. So I'll present the 3 ways that emerge in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, and then I will trace them through world history and suggest that they're still with us. This is the first way to do it. You may have heard 2 Norwegian brothers ask the question, what's the meaning of Stonehenge? And I will tell you what the meaning is. The meaning is that you try to establish a center of gravity for humans who will try to then make up a large group. You will recall that it is at this stage, we don't quite know when they started this. We're talking 30 million man-hours that went into what is now Stonehenge. It's an enormous, what is now subterranean area around here. This is merely the epicenter. Why did they build this? And the answer seems to be that it invited community. The city is often thought of as the place of exchange, that there was an economic logic behind the emergence of the first cities. That is not to be discounted, but the first cities we know of are actually places of cultic worship. So the first impetus to having places where people could converge was not economic, it was cultic. And this was a cultic place. Now, where is the other in Stonehenge? Well, you don't see the other. The other is simply those who refuse to be drawn in by the project. So you pull up a monument to celebrate a self that you will make by actually putting up that monument. It's a constitutive act. There is no self before this thing goes up, right? There are only small dispersed selves. The whole point is to try and congregate a larger self. So the other simply becomes those who are not drawn in by Stonehenge. So the first historical way of doing this emerges in the Neolithic, and it is celebrating the self by building monuments where the other is absent. Its presence, its presence is an absence, as it were. Now, here's another way of doing it. This is well, as you can see, this is not from a desert. This is a picture by Vershagin that hangs in the Tretiakov museum in Moscow, and it depicts a pyramid of skulls. Now, we know from archaeological and written evidence that this goes back to the beginning of the Bronze Age. And the story is very simple. The Indo-European groups in the Eurasian steppe would decapitate their enemies and take the heads back to their leaders, their veikportis, as the Proto-Indo-European term goes, in order to get their reward. And then they would put the skulls in a pyramid in order to celebrate their victory over the other. So you see, this is a rather different way of depicting the other and celebrating the self than what we just saw. At Stonehenge, the other is there as an absence. Here, the other is very much in your face, right? I mean, the whole thing is the other, right? And this is a way of doing stuff that has a continuous presence in world history. I'll come back to that, but it starts in the Bronze Age. And there is a very good material reason why it starts in the Bronze Age. In order for this to happen, you have to chop off heads. And in order to chop off a head, you need a sword made of bronze. You can't chop off a head with a block of stone, right? So it's a Bronze Age thing. This is the third way of doing this. The illustration is not quite clear, but this would be Ramses himself, the pharaoh. And what you see there would be captured sea peoples, migrants who have been wreaking havoc around the Egyptian polity. This one went up in the 1300s before our era. And as you can see, it's huge. Well, you can't see that, but I can tell you it's huge. It was placed on a temple wall, and the reason why it was placed on the temple wall is quite interesting. It's actually of the essence here. In order to be a monument, remember, things have to be big, right? If this had simply been a cameo, it wouldn't have been a monument. Now, as it happens, we can trace the Egyptian pictorial tradition back to the first dynasty, which is probably sort of some 3,000 years before our era. And the first picture we ever know of in the Egyptian tradition has a pharaoh standing on his knees and holding up a tiny little enemy by the hair, right? Why, at this particular historical juncture, is there a need to project this small little picture of the other onto monuments and make them big? Well, the answer, I think, is quite simple. This is an era in which first Ramses II and then Ramses III emerged from out of foreign rule. We see these people coming out of a 250-year period where they had been ruled by the Hyksos. The Hyksos were basically Semitic people with other peoples thrown in that actually conquered Egypt because they had access to a military technology that nobody else in the region had, namely Indo-European charioteers and different kinds of strategy thinking from the Eurasian steppe. So this is, the pharaohs emerging from a period of foreign rule, being threatened by the migrants that come in here, and in order to celebrate how big and tough they are in their victories against the sea peoples, they write themselves large in monuments. So what we see here I've called the enemy or the other suborned, the other held down, right? So that makes three basic ways of showing us the enemy in monuments: as an absence, as death, and as suborned. Now, I'm going to trace these three pictures through history in a sort of pretty quick tour. Now, I'll actually have two of these because this is literally our home ground, right? You recognize these. One from Uppsala, one from outside of present-day Tønsberg. They are mounds. They also come from the Eurasian steppe, where they are called kurgani or kurgans, barrows. The whole idea is when a chief dies, you simply put him in the soil, slaughter a lot of people that go with him, and then sort of throw up a mound above him. And these things are very useful for research. For example, I had a neighbor who had this idea that the Vikings had discovered America by the name of Helge Ingstad. And no one really sort of took this very seriously. It was mentioned in the sagas, but it wasn't proved. So the thing he did, he had a very easy research strategy. He got hold of a ship, got on board, and sailed across along the coasts of North America, where he had expected a ship from this neck of the woods to fall. And then he just sailed along the coast in order to spot a mound, because his thinking was if Vikings had been there, a chief must have died at some point, and they would have buried him, and they would have buried him in a mound. And sure enough, he sails up, he spots the mound, he goes on shore, he digs, and there are the remnants of the Vikings. That's how we know that the Vikings have been there. This is a way of celebrating the self where the other is absent. It's simply a mound, right? And the tradition goes from the Eurasian steppe way into this place. And I would say that we have these kinds of monuments all over the place. Now this is a rather different story. Does anyone recognize this monument? I'm guessing it's the arches of swords. Damn right. It's the two swords built to celebrate Iraq's victory over Iran in the 1980s. And the swords are not the point here. The point is, what is in all these nets? Do you see what it is? Helmets, exactly. It's not the skulls anymore. It's simply the head, the metaphorical head, as it were. And to add insult to injury, not only are these helmets of conquered soldiers, enemies, there are also additional helmets in the tarmac all around the monument, so that lorries, cars, buses, etc. will drive over these helmets on a minute-to-minute basis, desecrating the fallen enemy. So this is what has come of these skulls. There's a rather long interval between the pyramids that were thrown up by the Mongols, by Timur Lenk, by the Ottomans, etc., and the 1980s thing in Baghdad. So I thought I should throw in this one for good measure. Does anyone recognize it? It's the Cele Kula, the Tower of Skulls in Niš, Serbia. And it's the result of an uprising by Serbs in 1809. The Ottomans chopped off the heads of their fallen Serb enemies, sent them to the Sultan, because of course they wanted their rewards, so they had to turn in the heads, had the heads prepared, and come back, built a tower, and slotted the skulls into the niches, as you can see. We don't quite know how many there were, but there were at least 190 skulls. Some of them are now gone, as you can see, but this is still very much with us. So the other is death. I mean, the tradition has fallen on hard times. There aren't that many examples of it, but it's still with us. This is something very, very different again. This is the other as absence. It's a church. To be more specific, it's the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna. But I haven't included it because it's San Vitale in Ravenna. I have included it because when the first Germanic chap to settle down and sort of make his state project not a peripatetic one, but a steady-based one, when he settled down, he built a capital that he called Aix-la-Chapelle. This was in the 790s. Who was the guy? Charlemagne, exactly. And he wanted it to be as similar to Byzantium as possible. So what he wanted to do was to make a replica of the sacred church inside the Byzantine emperor's palace. But that wasn't available to him. So he took a church that was a replica of that church again and tried to build his own church in his own capital along the same lines, copying it. I was about to say measure for measure, and I should say that because he used the Roman imperial foot as a way of measuring stuff, just for the heck of it, because no one used the Roman imperial foot anymore. But the whole point was to replicate the Roman Empire. The point of this monument, of celebrating the self, was to mark the translatio imperii, the translation of empire from Rome via Byzantium to his own Aix-la-Chapelle, right? And that's a way of doing monuments with the, I would say, other absent. The other is the heathens. They're not there. They're invited to come, I mean, heathens are supposed to be converted at some point, remember? But they're not actively sort of present in the monument. This is another way of doing it. This is not Asterix, but it's the guy that Asterix is supposed to look like. You see the moustache there, and you remember Asterix immediately. This is a monument put up in 1865 by Napoleon III. And it depicts the guy who stood up to Julius Caesar when Caesar was on his famous rampage around Gaul. He actually conquered Caesar in a battle, but he lost the war, and Caesar took him back to Rome in chains, paraded him through the city, and executed him. Now, why would the French put up a huge chunk of a statue like that? Because it's an anchor of the French nation. There is something very national about this thing, because it's supposed to be a celebration of the French nation by denoting, by indexing our ancestors, the Gauls, as the saying goes. But it's also a monument to how the Gauls were conquered by Latin civilization. So the duality is, this is our ancestor, but he didn't fall in vain. He fell, but that fall brought in everything we hold dear, namely Roman civilization. And I would say that we would find stuff like this all over the globe now. I mean, in Norway alone, I can think of 3 or 4 different statues that would have this kind of thing, you know. Smack dab downtown in Trondheim, for example, you will find a specimen, and you will find stuff all over the place. In Turkey, there's an Atatürk monument built on the top of Phrygian mounds that should sort of specifically is supposed to anchor the Turkish nation to a long step tradition in that part of the world, in Anatolia. So, just as the idea of a translatio imperii and of building the same kind of churches are supposed to glue you to a past, this way of, should we say, anchoring the nation in a far past is of interest to us, because it celebrates the self, but it has the other as absence. Crystal Palace is not a football club. That would be Crystal Palace FC. Crystal Palace Football Club was formed by people working in this building called Crystal Palace. And Crystal Palace was built for the World Exhibition of the Industrial Nations in London in the mid-19th century. This is obviously a monument celebrating the self. It's the hottest in technology, not only in architecture, but in technology at this point. And the other is nowhere to be seen. It's quite obvious which others we're talking about. We are talking about other industrial nations that are not able to build such a big building, and we are talking about the non-industrial nations that do not even enter the race. But I read Crystal Palace as something akin to Stonehenge. It's a monument put up to pull in all the world and say, here I am, come to me and share my spirit, as it were. So this is, I would say, the beginning of world community. That's what's suggested here. And contemporaries acknowledged it as such. A number of visitors wrote about it and were appalled by the whole idea, by the sort of sheer global thrust of it. Dostoevsky famously saw it as a monument to a barren materialism, and between the lines is to a barren non-national world. I think certain people in that neck of the woods are still sort of quite anti when it comes to this kind of project. So, you know, there's a line to be drawn. Crystal Palace is in the middle of the 19th century. This one is but 2 years old. Terribly ugly, by the way. Destroys the skyline of London. But the same kind of idea, you know, strutting out and saying, here we are. This is yet another kind of absence, I think, in memorials. You will recognize the two principal parts of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. You walk past this wall, and this wall has all the names of the American dead. Every single one is supposed to be there. But when you look at the wall, all you see is your own face, the reflection of your own face thrown back at you. And these three gentlemen look distinctly lost, even without the snow. So where is the other? The other is absent. But the other is absent in a very new way. The other is simply there as someone who had the temerity to inculcate grief for the self. Right? There is no mention of the Vietnam dead here. No mention of all the atrocities done to the Vietnamese. It's only about our fall, our grief. You know, how could they do this to us just because we came and visited, kind of thing. The Arch of Titus. Now we're moving to the third theme. I've tried to cover the emergence of the idea of the other as death, the emergence of the idea of the other as an absence. We're now at the emergence of the idea of the other suborned. In the 2nd century of our era, Romans started throwing up these things, Triumphal Arches. And I've not chosen this one because it was amongst the first. It wasn't. It was a century late for that. I've chosen it for these. Can you see what this is? This is a menorah, a 7-pronged candelabra. Key symbol of what? The Mosaic faith, right? These people are Jews. And the whole idea is that the Romans have looted and taken over Jerusalem and are parading the captured people and stuff, including sort of this very important symbol, into Rome. And the Arch of Titus is built where this procession actually passed. So it's supposed to be an in-situ representation of the suborned other passing by. There are good reasons why the Jewish community in Rome hates this statue. You know, on the day when Israel was declared, the Jews of Rome congregated before the arch and went backwards through the arch to demonstrate that they were sort of leaving their captivity again, which I think is a quite pretty cool idea. If you thought there was something something familiar about the Arch of Titus, you were right, because beginning in the 1500s, as part of the Renaissance, as part of the rebirth of the Roman Empire, people started throwing them up again in Europe. And the Arch of Titus was perhaps the key model for the new ones. This one would be one of them. L'Arc de Triomphe in Paris. There are 2 l'Arc de Triomphe in Paris. This is the one at Champs-Élysées, the most famous one. And sure enough, I don't have the relief here, but if you look inside, you will see fighting scenes of how the other is being suborned. Right? I'll put this one in there as a memory for us of how things need not be this way. This is not a monument. This is a small stone tablet inside one of the Oxford colleges. So why have I included it if it's not a memorial? Well, I made the point that one of the things out of which memorials will grow would be a pictorial tradition. And I mentioned the examples of Egypt, where you had the other suborned depicted already 300 before our era, but it took 1,700 years before it came from that point and into proper memorials, proper monuments. This is the college's way of marking their dead in the First World War. And the key thing about it is that it simply lists the names of the fallen in alphabetical order. There is no way we can know which side these people fought on. They could be German citizens, they could be British nationals, they could come from anywhere else. If there is a name there, Fritz Neumann, for example, we can guess that he would have been a German, but we cannot be certain. So all the fallen are just thrown in and noted together. But I have yet to find monuments which do that. There is one genre of monuments that do exactly that, but they don't have names. That would be the monuments to the unknown soldiers. But the monuments to the unknown soldiers are not celebrations of selves. They are memorials of dead. They are not built to celebrate a self. They are built by other people to celebrate what they don't quite know, stuff, you know. So they fall outside of the purview here. So to sum up, there are three ways of depicting the other when celebrating the self in monuments in world history. They are the other as absence, the other as death, and the other as suborned. And I would end by saying that I think we should be wary of this idea of the other as absence, because as the war memorial in Vietnam to the in Washington to the Vietnam War demonstrates, there is something rather worrying about just forgetting about the other. When you remember the other as suborned, you know, there is you pay a compliment to a valid fight. You indicate that the other is still out there waiting to fight another day. Even when you build a pyramid of skulls, you know, you acknowledge that there was a fight here. The other fought back. Okay, he lost, but there they are. But the absence thing is dangerous because you somehow try to obliterate from memory what went on. So I don't quite know how to publish this, but maybe it should be as a hate mail to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. Thank you. Mm-hmm.